this notion of what's romantic. And this older generation, I think, has been taught that essentially what romance is to them is this like power dynamic of somebody has to like overcome the person, and somehow that's romantic, right? We don't ask for consent, we just assume it. We don't ask questions. I also even have a lot of couples that refuse to schedule sex even if they're not having sex because it's not romantic. Somebody has to start it, initiate it. That just comes down to power. And so I think the difference between your generation, my generation, and even the next generation after me, because I'm a millennial, and so now we've got these Gen Zers, is that we're shifting that definition of romance to be less about this one person has a power dynamic and to think about equality and to work towards supporting each other.
I'm Rachel Green, divorce mediator and collaborative attorney. Join me as I chat about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. Hello, and welcome to Keep the Kids in Mind. I'm Rachel Green. This is my podcast about children whose families are going through restructuring. This morning, we're very lucky to have Sarah Alvi. She is a New York-based licensed marriage and family therapist who's certified in sex therapy. Sarah works with individuals, couples, and multi-partner relationships with the goal of helping them cut through the noise, be it anxiety, depression, relationship chaos, or just the chaos of everyday city life. Sarah, welcome. I'm so pleased to have you as my guest here on Keep the Kids in Mind.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're really at the forefront of some of the major choices and drives and everything that's affecting relationships that are in transition. And I'm wondering, how did you come to do this work? What has drawn you to want to work with people who are sort of on the firing lines of dealing with relationship changes?
So I actually came from welfare and juvenile justice work. I had been working in that for 10 years. I worked for a non-for-profit that essentially did home-based family therapy for families that were in one of these systems, in order to kind of prevent them from going further into the system, but also with the goal of generationally helping that if we can work with one nuclear family, how will that impact like their children's kids and their children's kids? Can we get to a place where we're seeing less and less families in these systems if we're doing preventive work now?
Interesting, because so many times those negative dysfunctional patterns do get just passed down generation and generation and generation. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? And for so many reasons, right? I mean, systemic injustice is such a huge part of that. When we're coming in punitive of telling families exactly what they can't do or shouldn't do without actually giving them the resources to shift that behavior or change those skills, then what are we really doing, right? We're just going in and telling them what they can't do and not replacing their behavior.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so part of our work was replacement behaviors, working with these families to help them understand, yeah, sure, you can't like these kinds of parenting techniques that you've picked up, whether it was culturally, whether it was through trauma, whether it was just not understanding parenting, whatever the reasons were, these skills that you've picked up, they're not doing great work and they're ending you up in some of these systems. And how can we shift and change that to get you to thrive feel like you're thriving within your family? And so something that I had really picked up while I was doing that work was just that at the core of these families, it was the marital or parental relationship. Whether they were together or not together, these kids were relying on adults to help them thrive. And if those adults didn't have a good relationship, then that's what the kids were learning. And so when I left that work, I thought it was like really important to continue doing that work from a private practice standpoint. And so I had gone into it wanting to work with adult relationships, whatever they looked like. And now being 2025 and the world's really shifting in its view of what a relationship is, I'm getting all different types of relationships in my private practice work, which has been really fun and really profound and really interesting.
Well, that's really quite a journey, and it's so great that you're doing this work. It is really kind of mind-boggling how much our acceptance of non-traditional relationships has grown in the last, like, 10 to 15 years. I never heard of it being discussed in the mainstream that somebody might choose to be polyamorous,
Sure.
let's say. And then certainly the younger generation coming up with all these different categories of sexualities and being, not just gay or straight, but you could be bi, you could be um,
And
asexual, you could be, so many different approaches to sexuality. It's kind of exploded. It's really.
it really has. I think, I think the biggest shift is that these things probably have existed forever. It's just no one's talked about them. No one spoke about them. No one was, um, sexuality has been such this taboo topic for so long that you keep it behind closed doors. And here you have generations that are out in the open about it, who they are sexually, what they want in the bedroom, out of the bedroom, how many partners they want it with, and really just creating this dynamic of anti-taboo, like allowing themselves to be open and explore and understand what they want and not be ashamed about it. And I think it's really helping shape topics around sexuality, behaviors around sexuality, responses to sexuality, to say, hold on for a second. Does this have to be so hush hush? Can there be a world where I can talk about this with my friends, with my family, and it not be so secretive? And I think as a therapist, that's part of our work, is really elevating that use of language in our sessions to these adults, to allow them to start to pick up that skill a little bit too, so that they can be having that conversation, not just in the therapeutic room, but outside of the clinic, essentially, right? And I always find it funny when I have these adults that come in, these clients, and they come in for sex therapy, and so of course we're going to be talking about sex. And the second, you say the word sex, or you say something like, help me understand your daily sexual practice weekly, like what does that look like? What are you longing for? It is just like shut, like they get so shy and they get so embarrassed and they get so shameful. Whereas when I have a younger generation client, it is like they came in knowing every single word, how to use that language, how to express themselves, what emotion comes with that. And it's really interesting to see the differences in dynamics between the quote unquote older generation versus that younger generation.
That's fascinating. I mean, so there's really like a sea change going on.
Yeah, like truly.
And have now I as a divorce mediator and parenting coordinator, I see the families where it hasn't really worked that well, and they're splitting up. And often, I mean, I see more and more conflicts. People come in with conflicts saying we are sexually incompatible.
Mm,
I want more, whatever, BDSM, and my
mhm,
partner is not interested in that. And that's just like how my sexuality has developed, and I need to explore it to feel like a full human being.
mhm.
And so we're splitting up. But you must work with families that are trying not to split up, or are not splitting up, just want to try to resolve conflicts.
Yeah,
Um,
I definitely have those families, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But also, there are sometimes these families or couples that come in for that last ditch effort of,
mm.
we actually think we're ready to split up, but we want to make sure that we've done everything that we possibly can before we do that. And so sometimes they actually come in with this like fortitude of like, prove us wrong. where
Uh-huh.
I feel like that those are actually my like tougher clients because I'm like, if this is what you want, like I'm not here to prove you wrong. But yes, those families that are coming in that aren't trying to split up, they want to stay together. What happens with a lot of adult relationships that are trying to shift their sexual practice or change something up when somebody is coming in and saying, I want to try this or that, and the other person is essentially saying no. One of my objectives is to kind of explore what the fear is behind that no. Like why is that a no? Especially if they've never tried it before, right? And like what is that? And I think that once you can get them talking about that to understand that, then that's where we can start to kind of set some rules or set some limits to allow. I think a lot of people, if they haven't, if they don't truly understand some of those um, different kinks, right? They're using what they've seen on TV. And we know TV is really exaggerated. Like, all
What?
of us exactly, right? And so they're coming in and they're like, I don't want to get whipped or I don't want to get beaten down or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden as they're saying those fears out loud, you hear the partner being like, "Oh, that's not what I meant by BDSM. This is
Mhm.
what I meant by BDSM," right? And then having a little bit of a conversation now rather than this I want to try this, yes or no. No, conversation stops. And I think once you can start to get that conversation going and flowing and start to kind of really elaborate, well, what if you try it this way or these limits or these boundaries, then it does allow the couple to kind of explore beyond their like normative defined sexuality practices that they've been used to. And then you start to see the other partner being like, well, if we're going to try your way, I'd like to try some of my things. And now they found this new way of speaking. And I think
Right.
that's a lot of it, right? Like there's so much fear behind what we don't know, what we've never tried before, what we assume is what's happening, right? Again, placed by social media or the things we've read or the things we've heard. And so I think when you strip some of that away, um, you're really just showing people like there's just different fun things to try in the bedroom. And if you don't like it, you never have to do it again. And if you do like it, great.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because those are some of the very same tools that I use in mediation. I mean, it all comes down to communication. It seems like, a lot of times I see, couples who are in conflict and they don't ask the question why. They sort of feel like, well, of course, he or she, or they, of course, they understand what I mean when I say, whatever it is. And if you dig underneath, when you ask the person, well, what do you think they meant? And they explain it. And it's not what the person intended, the speaker intended. That we assume that somebody's hearing something the way we intend it, but
Mhm.
they don't necessarily hear it that way. And
Absolutely.
if you
I mean,
stop and ask why, then you can make the communication land and be heard the way it's intended. But people
absolutely.
don't ask why. They just go, 10, 5, 10, 5.
Totally, right? And I have so many couples or multi-partner relationships that they're looking for not just perspective taking, but they want them to understand exactly from their own lens. When you're talking about conflict and there's this like thought around, um, but I just want them to get where I'm coming from and I just want them to understand what I mean and right and that is like that source of the why, right? Like I need this. And when you even break some of that apart, it's like why is that important? Because the person you're looking to perspective take, they might be able to perspective take only 20%. Like their experience isn't your experience. Their view isn't your view. And they might say, okay, I can see where you're coming from, but they might still disagree with it, right? They might still say, that isn't my take on it. That isn't my lens, right? And so what is this need to get someone to see it your way and only your way? Um, and what it really comes down to is that you think you're right. And if they can see it your way, then then you will win this argument. Being open to the fact that um sure, each of us want to understand each other and hear each other and um support one another within those communication tactics. But how do we do that in a way that isn't also forcing them to come to this side where we are standing? Because again, right, different experiences, different backgrounds, different everything. And that is part of that relationship as well. And how do you include those experiences as part of the conversation and not the um as the wrong way, as the alternative, as the space that it is just your views aren't my views and therefore they're wrong.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, how would you say that this kind of exploration impacts children, if it does at all? Maybe it's all done in privately by the adults. But do you think that, or have you seen, have you worked with families where some issues with the children have come up as well?
Absolutely. Even those adults that think it is behind closed doors, it's not behind closed doors. Kids see and pick up everything. And so those types of things, I think the way they impact kids is you're modeling for kids how to communicate. If you are a parent, children are watching your communication skills, your relational skills, the ways you want to be heard, don't want to be heard, relate to another person, etc., all day long. And so, whether it's positive or negative, and they're picking up on those cues. And they might start to either do the same thing, or if they're like, oh, mommy is always shut down by daddy, for example, that means I have to speak louder. And so you'll see kids that might be acting out in some places when they feel like they're not being heard or listened to or understood, because that's what they see. Right? Is that one of their parents acts out when they feel misunderstood. And so now I should do that too, because then I get what I want. Then I get the given, right? The like, okay, like if you're gonna scream at me, just do what you want, right? And so I think they pick up on those behaviors. I think there's the opposite of that as well, where they might shut down, right? Where they are seeing, their families maybe not be able to resolve conflict in a healthy manner. Now kids are becoming conflict avoidant, right? Oh, I don't want this. So I'm going to go the opposite spectrum and I'm just never going to address conflict, right? Because what I've learned is that conflict is bad. And why would I want to do that? And so I think it's kids are constantly picking up and modeling their behaviors after what they see in front of them. And it really, I think that's some of the nurture part that comes in of how they pick it up.
Yeah.
Right. Like I said, like one kid might go loud and another kid might shut down. I think those parts aren't predictable, but all of those behaviors are in responses to what they've seen.
But it's interesting what you're saying, because it seems like what I'm hearing is that sexuality is just part of human behavior. And the challenges in every arena are the same, which is listening to each other, understanding each other, testing your understanding to make sure that, the way that someone is hearing something is the way that the speaker intended it to be heard. And
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
sexuality is just communication between our bodies, right?
right. I guess it
And
is.
yeah, right? What feels good? What doesn't feel good? How would the person around you know that if you're not telling them, showing them in some way,
Right. So,
right?
do you think this whole movement of, explicitly asking for consent, which is something that also this younger generation has come up with, that is it feels unromantic to the older generation? And then, of course, those of us oldsters were brought up at a time when, date rape was considered acceptable, and and sexual aggression in the workplace was considered acceptable. It was women's fault if they dressed, they must have dressed too provocatively or something, right? So I mean, the culture has really changed. The whole Me Too movement and all of that has really, I think, improved things as far as communication goes. And
Yeah,
um,
I think this older generation has come from a place where society put a lot on women,
yeah,
right? Like that we had to do, I identify as a woman. We had to do everything, right? Like
yeah,
we had to tell you if things were not okay, right? You didn't have to ask. Like we were the determinants of everything, and if we didn't exercise our voice, then how would we know? But at the same time of the society being like, well, women should tell us, they were also shutting us up, right? Society was also telling women to not speak, right? And so you're putting women in this place of you're telling me to speak up while you're also telling me to shut up, and I don't know how to navigate that. And so I think now where we've got this younger generation that has labeled that and has created pathways for women to feel strong, to feel independent, right? We've got this whole movement where we've there's more women CEOs than there ever have been in the past. There's more women leadership. There's more women in the workplace. Less women are having children, right? We're seeing these shifts and we're seeing these changes, and so I think as that's happening, women are utilizing their voice to say what they want. And I think one of the things that uh, women have realized is that I think it is important to ask consent multiple times because we're trying to break out of this systemic injustice where it was like, well, you said yes the first time, so how could you say no at any
right,
point?
right,
And I don't know about you, but there's been many times that I've had a sexual experience where I've kind of been like, wait, that doesn't feel like, oh, yes, yes, yes. But now this doesn't feel good. I don't want this thing, right? That's
right,
happening. The thing I said yes to, I wanted that, right? Like it's, think of food, right? Like you order this meal and maybe this meal comes with a sauce that you didn't like, right? And you're like, well, yeah, I wanted everything except this, right? And what do you ask the waiter for? You ask them for a substitution, right? Sex is the same thing, right? And so I do think that consent is important, especially when you're exploring different things that you've never explored before and being open to the fact that saying yes right now might not be yes in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes, or in 15 minutes. I don't know what my body's going to do. I know what my mind is going to do, but sometimes my body reacts. And I think when both parties or multiple parties, if there's multiple partners, are informed of that and can be open to that shift and are all checking in with each other. I do think that consent doesn't have to be one way. I think it is multiple ways. I think it's everybody's responsibility. I think if you can look at it from that way, then yeah, I don't think that checking in for consent multiple times can be bad.
it's fascinating to me to hear you say this because certainly I've had sexual experiences that I felt were foisted on me. I couldn't find the language to say no. I didn't feel like I necessarily had the right to say no because I was raised at a time when I was taught, I really was taught that my number one job in life was to try to please men and the men that were, I was around, be it my boss, be it my
Sure.
boyfriend, whoever it is. And I hope all the women your age are, many are managing to avoid.
I wanted to touch on one other thing that you had said, which I thought was really fascinating, this notion of what's romantic. And this older generation, I think, has been taught that essentially what romance is to them is this like power dynamic of somebody has to like overcome the person, and somehow that's romantic, right? We don't ask for consent, we just assume it. We don't ask questions. I also even have a lot of couples that refuse to schedule sex even if they're not having sex because it's not romantic. Somebody has to start it, initiate it. That just comes down to power. And so I think the difference between your generation, my generation, and even the next generation after me, because I'm a millennial, and so now we've got these Gen Zers, is that we're shifting that definition of romance to be less about this one person has a power dynamic, and to think about equality, and to work towards supporting each other. And I think personally, I think that's way more romantic than someone having to come in, read my mind, assess what's going on, and then just go for it. And then I have to just go along with it because they quote unquote did all of this work, right? Like because they initiated and they started this thing and whatever. And now I just have to go into it. And it's like, no, hold on. I have a voice. I have needs too. I have desires. And so I think thinking about those things too, right? Like, and why I say that scheduling sex is like, I just had a conversation with someone and they were like, but scheduling sex, that's so unromantic. Single people make dick appointments all of the time. Like all of the time, right? They schedule their sex because they're so busy. And so I really think that we've got to start shifting that thought around what's romantic and what's not romantic, to assess like, well, if romance is coming from a power dynamic, is that truly romantic versus a
Right.
love
And
based?
romance, yeah, romance being like, this is something we both, love, and I want you to love it and you want me to love it, and we can do it, like you're right, because you make dinner reservations at a nice restaurant, so why wouldn't you, make, yeah, no, that's really interesting.
So I think that for open relationships, yes, I do find I have met many polycules, multi-partner relationships that are successful. I think the difference between a multi-partner relationship and just a couple is, other than the fact that there's so many more people, there's more personalities, right? There's more experiences and there's more trauma. And so the best work that I can do with the multi-partner couples versus a two-person couple is it's generally a family therapy dynamic, right? You've got multiple people in the room that have multiple wants, needs, desires, also all want to be heard, also all want to hear each other, want to perspective take, want to communicate better, want to love better, want to, and, and with multiple people, right? And so that's when you've got a whole family in your room, right? Trying to figure that
That's really
out.
interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's a very
And
interesting way to look at it, is that it's like a family.
it's
I
a
mean, it's like,
family.
yeah. So all these other adults are included in the family.
Exactly. Right. And everybody and yeah, sure, they're all, you know, having sex with each other. But I got to be honest, when they come into therapy, the sex part is actually somehow usually taken care of. Like that usually isn't the presenting
Isn't the
issue for
problem.
the multi-partner
Right.
relationships.
It's the feelings
It's
of
the
the other
feelings, it's
adult.
the emotions. And I think another recipe for success for that, for the couples that thrive in those settings versus the couples that don't, is the ones that are open to their partners falling in love with other partners. I think when you open up your relationship and you think it's just about sex, or you think it's just about dating, or I'm not meeting all of your needs, you're going to find somebody else that meets their needs. Well, what happens when somebody else meets your needs? You fall in love with them. And I think when you're open to that and open to accept that that my partner might have multiple partners, including myself, that they're in love with, and I can accept that and maybe even introduce them to this family dynamic, that's I think where success really starts to grow.
And how do the kids fit into all this? Like, do the children feel like they have new extra step parents? Or,
Yeah.
or I mean, I'm sure there are some, families that are like communes, or
Hmm.
right,
Yeah.
sister wives. I mean, then the kids just accept it. This is how I live. right? I have 6 parents who live with me on this homestead or
Right.
whatever, but, um,
I think this is where it depends on the relationship and how you're defining the relationship and what you want the parental role to be. So yes, I think all of those scenarios are true. You have some of these polycule couples that have somehow joined. Maybe each of them have kids or have brought kids in from a prior relationship, and they might choose to kind of raise them together and work together. And yes, I did. And then I think the kids are just kind of looking at like that these are kind of all my caregivers. I don't know if they're calling them all their parents, but they absolutely are looking at them all as this is the village that it takes to raise me. These are all of my caregivers, and this is what I have been taught. And I think for those kids, I think the pros are no matter what they get to when you have a problem that maybe nobody can understand, you feel isolated. And what I'm seeing with these kids is that one of these 4, 5, 6 plus people is going to actually hear me in a way that maybe my primary parents won't.
right.
And therefore
Which
I can go to them and right. Like it's kind of like when
right,
you
which
go
all
to
all
your
kids
school
yeah,
aunt.
right, exactly. All kids can have that experience, that
Right.
my neighbor, my friend's mother who gets me the way that my mother doesn't. Yeah,
Exactly, but maybe they're living in the same household, maybe they're not, but because the households are shared in some capacity, they have access to all of these caregivers. I think some are doing the commune thing, like you said, and are just all living together and kind of figuring out that commune aspect. But then you have those polycules that there's primary parents; those are the only parents. We live together. These are who are we're raising our kids with, and so then they're doing the dating and the falling in love and everything else outside of those doors, and where maybe, and I don't think that the kids are as exposed. I think they think that they leave them with a babysitter or a caregiver, and they think mommy and daddy are going out, or mommy and mommy, daddy and daddy, whatever the
right,
dynamic is there. And then they have these agreements on like, we only do this together, right? And so we get the babysitter, we get the nanny, and then they think that mommy and daddy are going out together, but instead maybe the parents are going out separately with their own partners, or maybe in some situations those partners end up all dating each other. Maybe they're going out together, etc. But the point is that the kids aren't privy to that information.
right, right. And kids, notoriously do not want to know anything about their parents' sex lives, but do you think that they inevitably will? I mean, I remember a case I had where um, they were splitting up because the husband was interested in BDSM and the wife was not, and he found a new partner who was, and they had this chair that was specially designed for BDSM, and
Okay.
it was in the living room, and during mediation the mother said, but you have that chair in the living room. Like the kids are going to find out what you're doing. And the kids at that point were like, 5 and 7. Like, of course, it was just a chair that was in the living room. But as they get older, like it's almost like the father was in denial that someday they would be teenagers and some days they'd be in their 20s and they would look back and go, oh, dad had that sex chair in the living room.
Yeah.
um,
I think, again, I think it depends on the conversation that you're having, right? I think that if you're trying to hide it from the kids, then yes. Do I think that eventually they'll find out, they'll figure it out? They're going to get to an age where someone knows more than they do, and their friends might be over, right? Like maybe they don't learn it, but a friend comes over who maybe their parent is open about sexual conversations with their kid,
or
and
porn,
right,
right?
and that kid
Porn that
says,
all
"Oh,
the
do you
kids
know?"
do.
Or porn, right? And the kids pointed out. So, do I think that at some point, eventually, the kids will figure it out? Yes, I think kids figure out everything. To be really honest,
I do too.
yeah. Um,
It's like a puzzle. Kids whose parents divorce, it's like a puzzle that they're trying to figure out as they go. Every year they get a little more mature, they understand more about the world, and they go, "Oh, that's what dad was doing when I was 6," you know?
Exactly, right? And kids are curious, and we want them to be curious, and we want them to explore, and that's part of how the human brain develops. And so, I think those are all good things. And so then I would kind of go back to the parents and say, it's not about whether the kids are going to find out whether this is a BDSM chair or not. I'm just curious why that chair is in the middle of the living room if you don't want your kids to find out.
I have another couple. The father wants an open relationship, the mother doesn't, so they're splitting up.
Okay.
But the father wants to bring other people into the home when he's going to be with the kids, like after the kids go to sleep, thinking, oh, well, they go to sleep and they'll sleep deeply and they'll never know that this other person came over. And the mother is, saying, like one of them could wake up, like they could get sick or something, and they'll come looking for you. And then they'll find this other woman in bed with you. Like you can't do it when the kids are around.
Yeah, I think my feedback for those families is, again, right, it goes back to this, like, what are we hiding? Do we not want these kids to think that if, especially if they're split up, that they're dating other people, that they're sexual, right? Like, because I think the more we hide kids, then what we're really forcing them to do is learn from other people, learn from other sources, learn on their own, right? Rather than actually just taking leadership in our parenthood and saying, no, maybe we have that conversation with our kids around that going through a divorce and we might be dating other people and you might see other people around and this is what this means and it doesn't mean that they're an alternate, right? And so I think this whole um space where we are hiding things from kids, all we're really doing is forcing them to learn elsewhere. That's all that hiding is.
Wow.
Instead of just being the experts and wanting our kids to actually hear our voices and teach them in our ways. And it is because we're uncomfortable, right? We are uncomfortable in teaching our kids about sexuality practice. So we'd rather have them learn it from their friends or from or from porn or from TV, right? Whatever, versus just like get comfortable with the conversation. Your kids need to hear it from you.
That's amazing. That's like earth shattering. Like you should probably run seminars on how to talk to children about sex.
I mean, there's so much literature out there about this,
Yeah.
about like how to talk to your kids about sex. And there's podcasts about, any medium that you prefer to learn, it exists
Yeah.
because the studies show that it is best to get comfortable about the conversation and to have it with your kids than have them learn elsewhere. Because when they're learning elsewhere, then they're not learning the way that you would have intended. And then you can't get upset or can't get mad when they're bringing things into the house that you were like, hold on, where did this come from? And it's because
Right.
you caused that.
Right. Because you didn't talk about it and then that's what they stumbled on.
Right. Kids are
Yeah.
curious. They
Right.
want to know
Right.
everything. They want to
Right.
understand the world, right?
They
And
do.
so if
They do.
you're not going to help them understand it, they'll find somewhere else that will.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, Sarah, we have to wrap up, but
Yeah.
just what as we do you have any takeaways that you would want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I think going back to this place where we're talking about kids is like kids, we got to give the kids the benefit of the doubt and we've got to allow space for them to learn. And we want to make sure that if you want to be the one that is facilitating or guarding the information, that you're also sharing that information if you're going to be a guardian. I think that's really important.
And
And
then yeah,
And then just allowing the fact that, yes, different relationships exist and there's different success factors for how those relationships work or don't work, but ask questions. If you don't understand, I think, really the moral of the story always is like, be open to asking more questions and having conversations. Don't shut things down until you're truly informed about what's going on, and then have a informed viewpoint.
And one of my takeaways from our conversation is just that communication really requires, not just hearing what somebody says, but checking that what you hear is what they intended.
Yeah,
And that has to apply to sexuality as well as other things that people have conflicts about.
absolutely. Yeah.
So it's been a pleasure talking to you this morning. Thank
Great
you so
job.
much for coming on. Keep the kids in mind.